The year is 1944. Japan's war in the Pacific is turning, and not in Japan's favor. Rebun Island sits at the northern extreme of the Japanese archipelago, a narrow strip of land in the Sea of Japan where the water is cold year-round, where fog comes in off the sea for days at a time, and where the cliffs drop straight to the water with the kind of permanence that geological formations achieve over millions of years. In peacetime, the island was known for its wildflowers and its fishing. In 1944, it was known to almost no one outside the Imperial Japanese military, and the work being done there was classified at the highest level. The island is approximately 25 kilometers long and 8 kilometers wide. Its population in 1944 was small, dispersed in fishing villages along the coast that had been there for generations, following the rhythms of the sea and the seasons with the practiced continuity of communities that have always been at the margin of what land and water between them make possible. These people were told nothing about the construction that was beginning in the cliffs above their villages. They heard it. The sound of metal on rock carries far in the kind of silence that prevails on an island where wind is the dominant acoustic fact. But what it meant, and who was doing it, and why, were questions they were not permitted to ask. What was happening in those cliffs was the construction of a network of tunnels designed to hide the weapons of a strategy that the Japanese military had developed in response to a specific and desperate problem: how to stop the American naval advance that was moving progressively closer to the Japanese home islands. The strategy was called Ketsugo, Operation Decisive. Its premise was that the American invasion of the home islands, which Japanese military planners assessed as inevitable and imminent, could be defeated not by matching American firepower conventionally. Japan no longer had the resources to do that, but by making the cost of the invasion high enough that the Americans would accept a negotiated end to the war rather than continue. The instrument of that strategy, in the waters around the northern islands, was the Shinyo, a small, fast motorboat packed with explosives and piloted by a single sailor directly into the hull of an American warship. Rebun Island's cliffs provided exactly what the Shinyo strategy required: natural rock faces with sufficient height and overhang to conceal the entrances to tunnels from aerial observation, access to the sea through paths that could be cut from the rock, and a remoteness that kept the operation invisible to anyone not directly involved in it. The young men who arrived at the island to dig those tunnels and train in those boats knew, from the moment they were assigned, what the assignment meant. The euphemism used by the military command structure was noble self-sacrifice. The reality was that each of these men had been placed in a position from which survival was not the intended outcome. The tunnels of Rebun Island were built with the simplest possible tools, because by 1944, Japan had neither the time nor the resources to bring anything more sophisticated to a remote island in the Sea of Japan. The work was done by hand: hammers and chisels for the initial scoring of the rock face, then larger percussion tools for the main excavation, with the broken material removed by hand in baskets and disposed of in the sea or covered with vegetation on the cliff top where it would not be visible from aircraft. The men doing this work were the same young sailors who would later be expected to use the tunnels. There was no labor force available beyond the unit itself, and the construction and the training and the waiting all fell to the same people. The rock of Rebun Island's cliffs is not granite. It is a more variable volcanic and sedimentary formation that changes character over short distances, with sections of hard, reliable stone alternating with zones that are softer, more fractured, and more prone to failure under the stress of excavation. This variability made the tunneling work unpredictable in a way that significantly increased its danger. A section that had been progressing steadily would encounter a change in the rock and become unreliable. Cracks appearing overhead, fragments detaching, the geometry of the space shifting in ways that required immediate shoring with whatever timber was available. Cave-ins happened. The official records of the period are incomplete, and post-war accounts from survivors are fragmentary and often given decades after the fact. But the consistent testimony is that rock falls during construction injured and in some cases killed members of the tunneling crews. The men who survived these incidents continued working. The alternative, being removed from the unit and assigned somewhere else, was not an option that the command structure offered. The environmental conditions inside the tunnels during construction and afterward were among the most difficult features of life on the island. The proximity to the sea meant that moisture permeated the rock continuously. The tunnels were cold and perpetually wet. The stone surfaces dripped. Clothing and equipment that was left in the tunnels for more than a few days accumulated moisture that could not be dried in the interior environment. The combination of cold, damp, darkness, and the physical demands of the excavation work produced health consequences. Skin conditions from sustained moisture contact, respiratory problems from the dust of the rockwork, the progressive physical deterioration that comes from hard labor in poor conditions with inadequate nutrition that were documented in the medical records of the units stationed on the island. The camouflage of the completed tunnel entrances was carefully managed. The goal was that from the sea, from the vantage point of a ship's navigator scanning the coast, the cliff face should appear unbroken. Nets were used to cover the cut stone at entrances. Vegetation was transplanted to grow against the cliff face at the appropriate locations. The path from the tunnel entrance to the water, down which the Shinyo boats would be launched, was cut to minimize its visibility from the sea approach angles and covered with materials that matched the surrounding rock. The invisibility that the installation achieved was real and sustained. Allied aerial reconnaissance of the northern Japanese islands in 1944 and 1945 did not identify the Rebun Island tunnel network as a significant installation. The Shinyo, whose name translates approximately as ocean shaker, was a weapon that combined the simplest possible technology with the most extreme possible demand on its operator. The basic design was a plywood motorboat, typically between 5 and 6 meters in length, powered by an automobile engine adapted for marine use. The explosive charge, 300 kilograms in the standard production version, was packed into the bow. The pilot sat in an open cockpit behind the engine, with a basic set of navigation instruments and throttle controls. There were no safety systems. There was no way to escape the boat once the mission was committed. The pilot's function was to navigate the boat from its hidden launch point to the target vessel, bring it to impact speed, and make contact with the enemy ship's hull. The result would be the destruction of the weapon, the target if the charge was sufficient, and the operator. The training conducted at Rebun Island and at other Shinyo bases throughout the home island defense network was extensive enough to be technically meaningful. Pilots learned to handle the boats in the sea conditions they would encounter. The Sea of Japan in autumn and winter produces swells and confused seas that required real skill to navigate in a small, low-powered craft at night. They practiced approaches and attack angles. They developed the ability to read the water at night, to distinguish the silhouettes of ship types, to estimate range and bearing under conditions of limited visibility. What the training could not prepare them for was the psychological experience of what they had committed to. The Bushido tradition within the Japanese military framed self-sacrifice for the emperor as the highest form of service, the most honorable death available to a warrior. This framing was presented, taught, and reinforced in the command culture of every Shinyo unit. But the frame that a culture provides for an experience and the experience itself are not the same thing, and the accounts that survive from men who served in these units describe a gap between the two that widened as the months of waiting extended. The fuel smell was a persistent physical feature of life in the tunnels. The Shinyo boats were stored in the tunnel network, their tanks full, ready for rapid deployment. The vapors from the stored fuel accumulated in the enclosed space and could not be fully cleared by the ventilation that the tunnel system provided. Men who spent extended time in the tunnels with the boats reported the specific cognitive effects of sustained low-level fuel exposure: headaches, difficulty with sustained attention, and at higher concentrations, the hallucinatory experiences that hydrocarbon vapors produce at the threshold of toxicity. Letters written by Shinyo pilots and recovered after the war describe the specific quality of their situation with a directness that cuts through the official framing. They describe the waiting, the cold, the smell of the sea and the fuel, the conversations with the men they were stationed with, who would also be sent out on the same missions. They describe the physical beauty of the island, the fog coming in over the water in the morning, the way the northern light fell on the sea in late afternoon, in terms that suggest the heightened attention to the physical world that comes from knowing your relationship with it is approaching its end. Extended isolation in confined, dark, and acoustically unusual spaces produces predictable effects on human cognition and perception. The science that documents this is solid and well replicated. The tunnels of Rebun Island, occupied by young men under extreme psychological stress, in conditions of poor nutrition, cold, darkness, and sustained uncertainty about when their assigned mission would be ordered, provided exactly the conditions under which those effects manifest most strongly. The acoustic environment of the tunnels was shaped by the same forces that shape the acoustic environment in any cavity in rock adjacent to the sea. Water pressure in rock creates sounds that are transmitted through the stone, low-frequency vibrations that arrive without a clear direction, that are felt as much as heard, that have no obvious source when you put your ear to the wall and try to locate them. These vibrations, in the frequency range that overlaps with infrasound, have documented effects on human perception. They create a baseline of unease that the conscious mind registers but cannot easily account for, and that primes the perceptual system to notice and amplify ambiguous sensory inputs. In the specific conditions of the Rebun Island tunnels, men in darkness, under stress, with compromised cognition from poor nutrition and possible fuel exposure, the perceptual effects of this acoustic environment were reported with consistency. Men heard things they could not explain. They perceived presences they could not locate. The sounds of water moving through rock at pressure sounded, in that context, like voices. The bioluminescence of the sea, the blue-green light produced by certain marine organisms that is visible on the surface of the water in certain conditions, particularly in the northern Japanese waters, appeared through the tunnel openings as light that moved without an obvious source. These experiences were documented in the accounts of men who survived the war and spoke about their time in the Rebun Island tunnels decades later. They described them not as supernatural events, but as experiences that felt overwhelming in the moment and that they understood better in retrospect, when they had the context of normal life against which to measure what the tunnel environment had done to their perception. The gap between the experience in the moment and the retrospective account is itself significant. It tells us something about the degree to which the tunnel environment had suspended the normal frameworks of judgment. One account describes a soldier who had been assigned to guard a tunnel section that was near the water's edge, where the acoustic effects were strongest and the bioluminescence occasionally visible. He reported experiencing a period of what he described as complete loss of time, not sleep, but a suspension of his normal awareness of duration, during which he was apparently responsive to basic commands, but had no subsequent memory of what had happened. This kind of dissociative episode, in the context of extreme stress, sleep deprivation, and possible hypoxia from poor ventilation, falls within the documented range of human responses to sustained impossible circumstances. The Shinyo units at Rebun Island were placed on readiness alert multiple times during their months of deployment. The alerts came when American naval activity was detected or anticipated in the waters approaching the northern islands. Each alert initiated the same sequence: the preparation of the boats, the assembly of pilots, the waiting in the tunnels through the hours before the expected attack window, the experience of the alert that ended in a stand-down, the discovery that the expected target had not materialized or had been diverted, or that conditions made the mission unfeasible, was, by the accounts of those who experienced it, among the most psychologically significant events of their deployment. The preparation for death is not easily undone. The process of writing the final letters, of performing the rituals of departure, of setting aside whatever remained of the ordinary self and replacing it with the operational identity that the mission required, all of this involved a significant psychological investment. To then be told that the mission was postponed, that the process would need to be repeated when the next opportunity arose, was a form of stress that the command culture of the units was not designed to manage. The hachimaki, the white headband tied around the head before a mission, carrying in its simplicity the full weight of the tradition of honorable sacrifice, was part of this preparation. Photographs from the period show these young men in their headbands with an expression that is difficult to characterize simply. The official framing was serenity, acceptance, even joy at the fulfillment of duty. What the photographs actually show is more complicated and less uniform than that. The range of human response to an impossible situation, captured in faces that were often very young, often from communities in which the military framing of their situation had been the dominant context for their entire adult lives. The waiting itself was a form of experience that the training had not prepared them for, and that the cultural framework of sacrifice did not fully address. Waiting to die is different from dying. The mind that is trained for a decisive act, that has oriented itself toward a specific terminal moment, finds sustained uncertainty particularly difficult. The absence of the expected moment extends indefinitely. The readiness must be maintained. The psychological state that the preparation requires cannot be held at a peak indefinitely, and the descent from it, and the reascent when the next alert comes, takes something from the person going through it each time. Some men, in accounts given or implied by surviving records, could not sustain this process. The discipline of the units was strict, and the social pressure within them was intense. The culture of the units enforced conformity to the required posture in ways that made individual expression of doubt or resistance difficult. But the human capacity to hold an existential position indefinitely under conditions of sustained uncertainty has limits, and those limits were encountered. The logistics of sustaining a unit of Shinyo pilots in the Rebun Island tunnels through the winter of 1944 and into 1945 were, in the most straightforward terms, inadequate. Japan's supply situation by late 1944 was severely constrained. The American submarine campaign against Japanese shipping had progressively reduced the flow of food, fuel, and materials that the home islands and the garrisons on them required. Remote postings like Rebun Island, which had no strategic priority in the resource allocation system above simple maintenance, received what could be spared, which was less than what was needed. The caloric allocation for the men stationed at the island fell below what their physical demands, the construction work, the training in the cold water, the labor of maintaining the installation, required. The response was adaptation. The island's marine environment provided resources that the supply system did not. Shellfish from the rocks at low tide, seaweed in varieties that the local fishing culture had used for generations, fish when the weather permitted the use of small boats. The men who had grown up in coastal communities and knew how to read the sea's available resources were valued within the units for this knowledge. Those who had not were taught. The water supply within the tunnels relied on collection from the rock face. The moisture that condensed on the stone surfaces and ran in thin trickles down to the tunnel floor. This water was cold and generally clean, filtered by the rock, and there was enough of it in the wet months of the northern island winter. In the drier periods, it was less reliable, and the management of water, knowing where it ran, when it ran, how to capture it, was a practical skill that the men who lived in the tunnels developed through necessity. The discipline system within the Shinyo units was structured around the same principles that governed all Japanese military formations of the period, but applied in a context that gave it a particular intensity. The men could not leave. They were not going anywhere, not on leave, not on rotation to a rear area. The unit was the entire social world available to them. In this context, the enforcement of the standards of behavior that the military culture required had a compressive quality. There was no escape from the community and its norms, no external perspective available to measure the internal standards against, no relief from the sustained pressure of the culture of sacrifice that every day of deployment reinforced. American aircraft occasionally flew over the island. The men in the tunnels could hear them. The sound of aircraft engines carries clearly in the acoustically transparent air of the Northern Sea, but could not be seen by them. The invisibility of the installation was also the invisibility of its occupants. The planes passed over, continued on their course, and the silence returned. The men below heard the sound of the enemy above them, and the enemy did not know they existed. On August 6, 1945, an American aircraft dropped a single weapon over the city of Hiroshima. The resulting explosion destroyed the city's center and produced casualties on a scale that had no precedent in the history of a single weapon's use. 3 days later, a second weapon was used over Nagasaki with comparable results. The news reached the Rebun Island unit through radio broadcasts that were fragmentary and interrupted. The communications infrastructure of the island was basic, and the transmissions from the Japanese mainland were not always received clearly. What the men in the tunnels understood from the initial reports was that a new type of weapon had been used, that the destruction it had caused was enormous, and that the framing of events being broadcast by the official Japanese information services was significantly at odds with what the scale of the reported damage implied. The response within the unit to the news was not uniform, and the accounts that survived described divisions that the official culture of the units was designed to prevent from forming. The command structure's position was consistent with the logic of Ketsugo. The war continued until formal orders to the contrary arrived, and the mission of the unit remained unchanged. Some of the senior personnel in the unit maintained this position with what appears to have been genuine conviction, not performance, but a real assessment that the situation required what it had always required. Among the younger men, the reaction was more varied. For those who had entered the unit very recently, men who had been assigned in the spring or early summer of 1945 and had been through the training and the waiting for only a few months, the news from Hiroshima arrived at a moment in their psychological development that was different from where the men who had been there since the previous year were. They had not been through as many cycles of preparation and stand-down. The system had not had as long to work on them. Their relationship with the certainty of their own death was more recent and possibly less settled. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio broadcast in a speech whose meaning, through the elaborate circumlocutions of imperial language, was surrender. The men at Rebun Island heard this. The war was over. The mission that they had been prepared to execute, that some of them had already prepared themselves to execute on specific nights of near deployment, would not be ordered. The hours after the broadcast were, by the accounts of those who lived through them, among the most difficult of the entire deployment. The framework that had organized their existence for months, the purpose, the direction, the identity of being part of an operation with a specific and terminal outcome, dissolved in the space of a radio broadcast, and what replaced it was an absence that did not immediately fill with anything recognizable. The orders that followed the surrender announcement were, among other things, an order to destroy. The Shinyo boats that had been stored in the Rebun Island tunnels were burned. The fuel that had been maintaining them in readiness, the explosive charges that had been packed into their bows, the equipment associated with their operation, all of it was destroyed or disposed of in ways intended to leave as little physical evidence as possible of what the installation had been. This was not a local decision, but a general order that applied across all special attack installations in the home islands and elsewhere. Before the Allied occupation forces arrived, the weapons of the Shinyo program were to be eliminated. The tunnel entrances were sealed. Explosives were used at some locations to collapse the passages near their openings. At others, the sealing was simpler. The camouflage that had been maintained to conceal the entrances during the war was left in place and reinforced, allowing the openings to be obscured without the noise and attention that demolition would have produced in the immediate aftermath of the surrender. Not all of the installations could be completely destroyed in the time available. The extent of the tunnel network at Rebun Island, the specific number and configuration of the passages, the total volume of material stored in them, meant that a complete erasure was not achievable in the days immediately following the surrender. What was achieved was partial. The most visible and most incriminating elements were removed. The obvious entry points were blocked or concealed, and the operational records that would have provided a comprehensive picture of the installation were destroyed along with the weapons. The Allied occupation surveys of the Northern Islands, conducted in the weeks and months after the formal surrender, did not achieve a complete account of the Shinyo installations in the area. The surveys were thorough in some respects, but limited in others. The remoteness of Rebun Island, the adequacy of the camouflage that had kept the installation invisible during the war, and the destruction of records meant that what was found was a fraction of what had been there. The men who had built and occupied the tunnels returned to Japan. The terms of the surrender and the occupation meant that they were not immediately available for interview by Allied intelligence, and the Japanese military's own documentation of the special attack units was subject to the same destruction orders that applied to the weapons. The survivors went home, to the communities they had come from, to the families who had expected never to see them again, carrying knowledge that the military culture they had come from had not provided them with a language to share publicly, and that the social context they returned to did not have a structure for receiving. The question of what remains in the Rebun Island tunnels, not destroyed, not found, is one that neither the historical record nor the physical surveys have fully resolved. The tunnel network was extensive enough that the destruction effort could not have been complete. The cold, damp environment that had been so difficult for the men who occupied it turns out to be favorable for the preservation of certain materials. Objects that were left behind when the installation was sealed, tools, equipment, personal items, may be in a state of preservation that reflects decades of stable, cold, low oxygen conditions, rather than the deterioration that surface exposure would have produced. What the sealed sections of the tunnel network contain is, as of the available record, incompletely known. In the decades after the war, the Rebun Island tunnel network largely disappeared from public awareness. The local fishing communities who lived on the island knew that something had been there. The sealed cliff faces, the occasional discovery of disturbed rock, or partially collapsed passages near the coast, the stories that had circulated in the villages about the young men who had appeared on the island and then gone. But the specific nature of what had been built and the purpose it had been built for was not part of the public record that the post-war years produced. The recovery of this history began in the 1980s and 1990s, as Japanese researchers working on the documentation of the special attack units began collecting testimony from survivors of the Shinyo and Kaiten programs. These testimonies were given by men who were by then in their 60s and 70s, and who found in the context of historical documentation a structure for speaking about experiences they had not been able to discuss publicly for decades. The accounts they gave were detailed, specific, and in many cases more emotionally frank than the accounts given closer to the events. Time and changed circumstances had made possible a form of honesty that the social context of the immediate post-war period had not allowed. Explorers and researchers who investigated the tunnel network at Rebun Island found passages that were still navigable and contained material from the war period that the destruction and concealment efforts had not eliminated. Personal items, equipment, documentation, objects associated with the daily life of the occupation had been left in sealed sections that had not been accessed since the war ended. The preservation was imperfect but significant. The cold and damp of the tunnel environment had not been kind to organic materials, but the harder objects, metal equipment, ceramic items, glass containers, survived in identifiable condition. The fishing communities of the island had their own relationship with the site that was distinct from the historical documentation perspective. Fishermen working the waters off the cliff faces where the tunnel openings had been described acoustic phenomena that they associated with the history of the location, sounds from within the rock or from the water near the cliff base that did not correspond to anything they could identify by conventional explanation. Whether these descriptions reflected acoustic properties of the tunnel network that were still audible, the same water pressure sounds in rock that had disturbed the men who lived in the tunnels during the war, or something more ambiguous, is a question that the scientific and the experiential traditions answer differently. The memorial that was eventually constructed on the island, a monument acknowledging the young men who had served and trained there, framed in terms of sacrifice and remembrance rather than the specific operational nature of their mission, provided a public acknowledgement that the site had a history. The memorial did not fully tell that history, but it marked the place as one where something significant had been present. The men who served at Rebun Island were, for the most part, very young. The Shinyo program drew heavily on men in their late teens and early 20s, an age at which the identity formation that the military culture could provide was most effective, at which the distance from one's own mortality was greatest, and at which the social pressure of a closed community had the most power to shape individual behavior. Many of them had never left their home prefectures before the war. Many of them had fathers and brothers and entire networks of expectation behind them that the military framing of their situation, the honor of sacrifice, the continuity of the family's commitment to the nation, was designed to convert into motivation rather than constraint. The particular quality of what was asked of them distinguished their situation from that of other military personnel who faced danger and possible death in the ordinary conduct of combat. The Shinyo pilot situation was not one in which death was a possible outcome of a mission whose objective was military. The death of the pilot was the mechanism by which the mission was accomplished. This distinction between accepting the risk of death as a condition of fighting and accepting death as the means of fighting had a specific psychological character that the Bushido framing of their situation addressed directly, and that the human reality of the experience engaged with imperfectly. The post-war lives of those who survived, the men who had trained and waited and prepared and were then not called upon to use their training, are part of the story that the tunnel network's physical remains cannot tell. Survivors from the Shinyo units have described the experience of returning to civilian life with a structure of identity that the military program had built and that peacetime had no obvious use for. The specific form of self-conception that the program had developed, organized around the certainty of a specific, chosen form of death, given meaning by a framework of national sacrifice that the post-war settlement had fundamentally discredited, left many of them in a condition that the psychological understanding of the period had no vocabulary for addressing. The tunnels at Rebun Island are not preserved as a museum. They are not accessible to the public in any organized way. The cliffs are still there, the sea is still cold, and the fog still comes in off the water in the mornings. The physical marks of the construction, the cut rock, the sealed entrances, the passages that run into the cliff face, exist within the landscape without being marked or interpreted. You could walk past them without knowing they were there. This is perhaps the most historically appropriate condition for them. The installation was designed to be invisible. The men who built it and waited in it were not supposed to exist in any public record. Their presence at that remote northern island, in those cold and dark tunnels, waiting for a mission that for most of them never came, was a fact that the world was not meant to know. The world eventually found out. The testimony of the survivors, gathered over decades, has made it possible to understand what happened there. But the understanding sits uneasily with any simple narrative of heroism or horror. It is more complicated than either, involving the full range of human response to a situation that had no good options, constructed by a system that had reached the limits of what it could sustain and was drawing on the youngest and most tractable members of its population to try to extend those limits a little further. The sea around Rebun Island is still cold. The fog still comes in,